Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 88. Well, stay tuned for more Kingdom Prologue this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Kahi, and I'm joined by our co-host, Pastor Todd Bordeaux. Welcome back, Todd.
Thanks. It's good to have you back in the country.
Thanks. It's good to be back. So we took a bit of a break from Kingdom Prologue last week. Got some good responses on social media, so that was encouraging to see. But we are back to Kingdom Prologue this week. Before we dive right into the content, I'll just run through the regular housekeeping that I can remember. I feel like I'm way out of practice on this, but our show notes page is at meredithkline.com/podcast, and there you can find all of the resources that we mentioned during the course of the episode. Let's see. You can also support us by giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. And you could also subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcatcher or podcasting app or whatever you use. Both of those things help give us visibility for others who are looking for good theological content in their podcasts. And finally, if you have the means to help us out to cover the monthly cost of hosting the audio files, you can find a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page, and any amount is much appreciated. We sure appreciate the generosity of those who have pitched in since this podcast started. It's really encouraging. So, gosh, Todd, it's been 2 weeks since we've been in Kingdom Prologue, but do you want to remind us where we were before we got to page 269 today?
Sure. We ended last time with the oracle concerning Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we talked about the curse of Canaan being fulfilled in the conquest in the book of Joshua. And we talked about Shem being the covenant community in which the promises would continue through Shem's covenant line. Of course, the Savior would be born from Shem's line. So Shem will lead to Abraham. And then Japheth, looking ahead to the new covenant age where he is the father of the Gentiles in a sense that are waiting for the Messiah to come. And so they would come back into the tent of Shem, and in the new covenant, Jew and Gentile become one in Christ. And all those are prefigured and prophesied in that oracle. And that brings us to chapter 10, which is a well-known genealogy, and it's a genealogy of the nations that descended from Noah. And before Kline gets to this, he spends a lot of time in review. He thought this would be a good place to sort of go back and summarize, and that's what we're going to do, just as brief as possible, to summarize what leads us to Genesis 10. So Kline begins by speaking of the pre-fall theocratic city that was the Garden of Eden, the place where God's Spirit resided, where God resided on the holy mountain. And Eden is called a mountain in other parts of the prophets. And so here God is residing on his mountain with the people he created. And so it was a place where man would worship God. On the mountain of the Lord, in the temple of the Lord, which was Eden. And that was also a place that would begin the cultural mandate. And as we talked about, that mandate would be eschatological in character. In other words, this is how God would bring about the kingdom that would last forever. Man would fulfill the cultural mandate, spread throughout the earth, bear children, have dominion, take dominion. And the kingdom of God would be built, and then finally would be consummated by the glory of God. And so Kline reminds us that the Garden of Eden is there is eschatology in the garden, that this wasn't the final place of man. The very fact that though Adam could hear God's voice, he could not see God. He could only see God in a theophany, but not as he is, as we read about, that we will see God as he is. That the garden was not the final place. It was a foretaste of that which would have happened had Adam fulfilled the covenant of works and the earth would have been glorified. So everything is looking ahead in the garden. And then in the post-fall, Kline goes on to explain that vertical access was lost. So man lost communion and fellowship with God because of the fall. So this time, as they leave the garden and go out, it's not to build the eternal kingdom under God's blessing, but it's in exile. So man is exiled out of the garden. The creation mandate is no longer eschatological. The creation mandate is only a common grace mandate, how life would continue in this fallen world, a world that would one day be judged because of the fall. And so Kline says here, redemption has to be introduced as another concept, not something man can build anymore, because man is now a sinner. And so the gospel is really answering the question, how do we get to that holy city that was prefigured in the Garden of Eden and lost in the fall? And that's when the deliverer is introduced, the one who will defeat Satan. And the new temple would no longer be a place, but would be in a person. God's incarnate Son would be the place where man would meet God. And so the redemption process, in a sense, is a reversal of the dispersion exile, as Kline says. In the redemption process, God does not scatter, he gathers. So he gathers a lost people to himself, and through union with Christ, he brings them to himself. It's the gathering of the elect, which is the opposite now of the dispersion from the garden because of judgment. And then Kline goes on to remind us, even though we haven't gotten to Old Testament Israel yet, he reminds us that Israel is a picture of the New Jerusalem. In a sense, it's a looking back. There's a retrospective look with Israel, because you have a pre-fall look. You have the 12 tribes extending throughout God's holy land, sort of a picture of the original cultural mandate as they take dominion over the land, and the land now belongs to God, and God is with them in the temple. So in a sense, it's a picture of what was supposed to be, looking back at Eden and the original mandate. But it's only typological. It's looking ahead. The prospective view, of course, is looking ahead to the church being the fulfillment of Israel as they are gathered to Christ as God's people. And then, of course, looking ahead to the fullness of the heavenly city, where there be a final regathering of the redeemed who are scattered throughout the earth. And so, in a sense, Israel looks back at what the world should have been, and it looks ahead to what the world will be through the gospel and through the first and second comings of Christ. All this is really a reminder of where we've been that would then bring us to Genesis 10 and how that fits into everything we've said. Any thoughts on that review before we jump into the genealogy?
That was extremely compact. Well done.
That was all biblical theology in 5 minutes. So when we come to the genealogy in chapter 10, Kline notes the common grace blessings first in the genealogy, because this is the expansion of the sons of Noah. And even though there's been a judgment on the earth in the flood, now they are going out and filling the earth again. And so we see these common grace blessings that God already spoke of in chapter 9, that man would be able to continue, and there would be a world and cities and governments and things. And so the very fact that we have chapter 10 is a fulfillment of this common grace promise, that man will be able to fill the earth, and there would be a common grace dominion, which includes believers and unbelievers. But Kline says there's also a common curse involved, because this expansion of the sons of Noah, for the most part, is not under the unity of God. They're not obeying God. This is a continued exile away from the garden. Even though the garden would have shriveled up by now, the idea is they continue out from where they are originally exiled. And so there is an aspect that the generations that are dispersed is part of the common curse. And it's interesting that as you read the first section, sometimes it's asked, how do you preach through these genealogies? And it's important to remember that in the Old Testament times, when the Jewish father would read these type of stories to the children, these are very famous nations, some of these. They would be nations when they were read. You can imagine the Hebrew children booing. Boo, these are the enemies of God's people. And so you have verse 7, Canaan. And then you have verse 10, Babel or Babylon. Verse 11, Assyria. Verse 12, the capital, Nineveh. Verse 14, the Philistines. Verse 19, Sodom and Gomorrah. All these are well-known entities in Old Testament history. All of them were judged for their sin, and most of them were judged for the sin not only of their own immorality and idolatry, but for persecuting God's people. And so these are the sons of Shem. And so even though Canaan is the one that most explicitly would experience the curse promised, all these nations would experience some judgment from God. All, of course, picturing final judgment, looking ahead. So in a sense, we're seeing the sovereignty of God, that these would be very dangerous enemies of God's people, and yet looking back, God took care of all of them at one time in history. So there is a lot of theology in these genealogies, even as you read the names, even though we may not recognize every single name. And then that brings us to Genesis 11. So Kline is not going to spend a lot of time on all these names. He's just going to note that the enemies of God are typically the sons of Ham. The sons of Japheth, and as they scatter, they're the ones that end up going to the coastlands, the islands, the very distant places, and they really disappear for most of the Old Testament. Most of the Old Testament deals with the nations that surround Israel that descended from Ham. And that includes Egypt, by the way. And Cush was mentioned here, sometimes identified as Egypt or as southern Egypt. And so with Japheth, you don't really see these names very often anymore. You see Magog, of course, once in Ezekiel, but most of these disappear for the most part. But they are spoken of throughout the prophets as one day these places of darkness will receive a great light. As in the New Covenant, of course, the gospel goes out to the sons of Japheth. And so Kline jumps pretty quickly to Genesis 11, and since he does, and we're following Kline, we will too.
Excellent.
So feel free to jump in, any thoughts that come to your mind. But Kline begins, as we look at the Tower of Babel, to note the religious character and the inner spirit behind this desire to unify and to build a tower. He notes that this is simply a revival of Lamech back in early on in Genesis 4, and then the sons of the gods that we talked about in Genesis 6. Both of them were idolatrous and raising themselves to a level of idolatry of gods, and both of them, through their own power, proceeded to take control of things and be the religious center of the world. And so that's what's happening again with the people in the plain here. Now, it says at the beginning, of course, that they journeyed either from the east, depending on your translation, but a better translation is they journeyed east. We won't get into the Hebrew of that, but the NIV actually captures that. It says, as people moved eastward. And why that's helpful, it just reminds us of the exile. The exile is eastward, east of Eden.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very likely that this is not a description of all the people in the world back then. It certainly wouldn't be a description of the covenant people, but the children of Ham that have journeyed east. And so Kline notes that their desire to build a city reminds us of Cain. Cain is exiled out of God's presence, and what does he want to do? He wants to build a city. So in the spirit of Cain, and Cain, of course, was doing this in rebellion of God, not repenting of his sin. It's the same with these people. And Kline notes that it's an answer to the religious emptiness in them, because they've rejected their creator, and yet were created as religious beings. So instead of just ignoring the religious questions and living life, they have to establish a religion of their own. And so they spurn God's promise of salvation, they spurn their creator, but they establish their own religion as with man as center. They're going to create a religion, and the ziggurat temple, which is what it is it's what they would build back then as a place where the priests could climb up the stairs and meet the gods coming down from heaven. But the very fact that they were building it and the fact that they were confident that they could meet with the gods shows that really it's an idolatry of themselves. Mm. They are creating their own idols and their own religion. And Kline notes that later the mythological versions from Babylon with their god Marduk had built a temple like this where he would meet with the people. But in the Babylonian version, it was a creation event. So Kline notes that their myth borrows from Genesis 11, but kind of ignores the key points that they were people of the fall. They were people under exile. So it completely ignores that they were sinners and they were exiled from the Garden of Eden. And it has them at creation building this. And of course, Marduk is the one who slays the dragon. It's not the promised Messiah who would slay the serpent. Mm. But Kline notes that there's enough similarities that would show that Genesis 11 is a real historical event that was then over the years, as it was retold, to, of course, glorify the Babylonians. They changed some key parts of the story, but the general outline remained, which shows that there is a common history behind that. And we saw the same thing, of course, with the flood, that the later Babylonian accounts of the flood have a lot of similarities with Genesis 6 through 8, but adds the idolatrous elements, of course. So let's stop. And any thoughts on that?
I had never considered the connection with the ziggurat before I encountered Kline, but it really adds a richness to the story to realize how religious these people actually were being. This was a concerted effort to climb up into God's presence, or at least to induce God to come down and meet with them part way. And that was, par for the course in terms of religion in the ancient Near East.
Yeah, think of how many other civilizations have done similar things, building some kind. I've toured in the Yucatan, the Mayan temples.
Right.
It was the exact same idea. The priests would go up to meet the gods. So this idea, we see it at the very beginning of history. It was fallen man's impulse. But I really like Kline's point that man is religious by nature. Even those who claim to be atheists are religious by nature. We can't escape it because we're made in God's image.
Right.
And so Kline explains that this becomes then the anti-city. The city originally was to be a city in devotion to God, offered up to him. And now it's the anti-city. It's the shaking your fist in God's face city.
Okay.
And what they're doing is they're turning common grace, the blessing of common grace, into idolatry. Instead of being thankful that though they deserve judgment, God is at least providing this world for them. They're going to turn that into idolatry and create their own gods, which of course favor them. Because the God of the Bible, the true God, called them sinners. So they're going to find gods and that make them feel good about themselves. It isn't that really the nature of all idolatry.
Right.
It's making gods that make us feel good about ourselves.
Sounds so unlike our time today.
Yeah. It is. It's exactly, and people use politics and they begin to worship politics and they just use politics as a religion, right, to feel good about themselves.
Right.
I'm on the right side. I must be a good person. And both sides do it.
Yep.
And there's that nature to make ourselves into something that will be accepted by the gods, however we define it. And so Kline explains that instead of the telos, instead of history having an eschatological end, with God coming down and bringing eternity and glorifying the world, they're creating their own eternity here, in a sense. Here will be where all religion is fulfilled. Here in this world we'll make a name for ourselves. And, it explains why in Revelation, for example, unbelievers are called those who worship the earth. And he's not speaking in a literal sense of, pantheists or those who think that the gods of a tree, the trees have God in them. It's speaking, you've made this world and this life everything. And you've rejected the hope of heaven. You've rejected the promises of God. And so Kline even notes this idea of them making a name for himself comes about in the Hebrew, in the play on words in the passage. Because you have the word there, Sham, and then the land of Shinar, and then in the heavens, Shemayim. So all these words that sound like name, right? Shem is name.
Mm-hmm.
And they make themselves a name, Shem. So Kline is saying, as you're hearing this in Hebrew, you're hearing these different connotations of the word name. And it emphasizes exactly what they're doing. They are making an immortal name for themselves. I remember reading the Aeneid, and with the Greek heroes, the Greeks did the same thing. When they wrote the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, the way to immortality in their minds was to do some heroic deed that your name would live forever. And there's a story in the Aeneid, and if I remember correctly, there's a boat race. And the man who loses the boat race wants to kill himself because now his name will not be immortalized. And since they didn't have much view of the afterlife, it was very confusing and shady, if we, the shades. The only way to make a name for yourself really is to do something so great that people will be talking about you in the future. And so here you have that idea. They're rejecting the hope of heaven. And instead they're going to make a name for themselves now that will live on. And so they want to gain a name among the gods, to be as gods. They're going to seize power by simply glorifying themselves. That's how they're going to find their glory, not in the promises of God. And then Kline brings us back to Genesis 10, speaking of Nimrod, because Nimrod here in verse 8 is the one who built the city of Babel. And so he was the one who probably came up with the idea, of course he had others, but to build this tower. And in verse 8, he's called a mighty one. And this brings us back to our interpretation of Genesis 6, right? The mighty ones, the sons of the gods.
That's right.
Not that they're taller than everyone necessarily, but they have exalted themselves, and they are mighty in the sense of their own political and human power. And so And then it says he was a hunter and he was mighty, and he did this before the face of the Lord, which is sort of strange because he's an unbeliever. And so Kline says it means either one of two things: before his face in the sense of in the face of God with a negative connotation, sort of in a rebellious way, or Kline says it could be a reference to the idea, the Romans 13 idea, that even unbelievers are appointed as judicial rulers in the common grace world. That's a difficult passage. But the point is that even by being referenced as a mighty one, there are claims of deity again, likely behind Nimrod and others, that we see later on. And Kline points out here, and we'll stop for a moment after this, that the later myths is that the gods built the whole city of Babylon. So Kline notes it is very likely that these men, like Nimrod, were claiming to be sons of the gods, like the pharaohs did. And that developed over time into the gods had actually built Babylon. Because the Babylonians didn't have any problem with the idea that gods would come down as men, like the Greeks would often do.
Right.
And so it was probably the boast of these men that later became the mythology of the later Babylonians. It's fascinating, isn't it, to think how all this is connected to the scriptures.
It really is. But it's so helpful. I mean, things that when I was growing up reading the Bible, I would have just read over without thinking twice about it. But I just really appreciate the connection to Genesis 6 and the mighty ones. I don't know what. Which take do you favor of the two that Kline offers for before the Lord or before his face?
Yeah, I think the first one, that's before his face, has sort of a negative connotation with boldness. That before the face of God, he was claiming to be a god.
Okay.
It was just showing his pride. It could be the second one, but I lean toward the first one.
Which sounds like it was just almost a tradition for kings of that time.
Yeah, it wasn't Lamech saying the same thing.
Exactly.
Right. It's pretty scary when you think about that's really anyone who gets power, even in our political climate. When the way they use the power, it's they have the same attitude. They may not phrase it that way. Or they may not even admit it to themselves, but that's going on.
I mean, we're all enlightened atheists today, but but you're right. I mean, their attitude betrays that that's exactly how they think about themselves.
And that's good you brought that up, because one of the advantages of studying the ancient world in Genesis is we see that man has not, quote unquote, evolved.
Right.
Into this higher consciousness or this higher morality, that all the impulses that are driving the men here are driving people today, just with different labels.
Right. And
so it helps to see the bigger picture of what's really going on. And that's what I appreciate what Kline brings out, is the impulse behind it that is always there. And it reminds us, and we can get a bit simplistic with this, but it's good to remind us that this is the difference between Christianity and all other religions, right? All other religions are attempt to build a tower to God in order to be accepted by him, by what we do. And in Christianity, man is helpless, and God has to come down on his own initiative and save us by grace. And so you can look at the different details of each religion, but in a nutshell, that's the difference that sets apart Christianity from all the human religions out there. They're all attempts to build a ziggurat, aren't they?
Absolutely. And I was reminded of that even on the trip home from Scotland. I ended up sitting next to a Roman Catholic girl, very nice, but I mean, when you get into dialogue and conversation, it boils down to be good. And at that point, there's no difference between what she believes and the rest of the world religions. I mean, they're all about just doing the best you can and pleasing God by doing that.
Yes, and creating a God that will accept us in basically the way we are, and in whatever way it takes to be accepted. We can create the terms. We can create the nature of God who will accept us. It's all created in idol. Whether we put it on a tower or we keep it in our minds, it's all the same, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And so all these, all these warnings against idolatry in the Old Testament are still for us today. So Kline goes on here and he talks about, verse 16 in chapter 11, where the Lord says that what they're doing is unstoppable. Of course, that raises a question: why would the Lord say that about anything on the earth?
Right.
And Kline's going to explain that. First, we're being shown that this is a Satan-inspired potential, that this is a satanic power that there's no human ability to stop. In other words, God himself is going to have to stop it. So the unstoppable is, of course, not that God can't stop it, because he will. But in human terms, there's nothing on this earth that can stop man coming together and, forming one religion, one political power. And what they can do on the earth is unstoppable. Surely the covenant community has no power in themselves to stop it. Now, behind this, the destruction of the covenant community is implied. We talked about that with Noah.
Right.
So it doesn't really say in Genesis 6 that they were in danger, but behind everything that's happening in Genesis 6, we are to assume that. Because if people, they're not going to like the message of the gospel, that they are sinners, obviously, and they are like Nebuchadnezzar later on, they are going to force everyone to bow down to their religion. And it will be the people of God that will refuse that. And so, again, when God comes down, we see that he almost always comes down in defense of his people,
mm-hmm.
not simply in judgment of sinners. And that's what he's going to do. So the unstoppable is a scary point. It's that there's nothing on this earth, if God doesn't intervene, to stop these people from destroying the covenant community. And so God has to then do something. And so the language then is God needs to come down. First, he comes down to see, right? Verse 5, there's irony here. And Kline points out the irony is these people think that what they're doing is so massive and the center of everything. And yet God looks down and says, I need to go down and take a look. So Kline is saying it's the use of irony here. It's to say, you're not so big. I can't see you from heaven.
Right.
Is the picture. Obviously, God could, but you know the picture here.
There's a little bit of mockery. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, okay, you grasshoppers build a little, a little grass thing. I'm going to have to come down and see what it is that you're so proud of. That's the idea. And so it's interesting that with ziggurats, it's the men who would walk up and assume that the God would come down to meet the priest. But God is coming down, but not to meet them on their terms. God's coming down to judge them for it. And so there's danger here, what they're doing. They're bringing judgment on themselves. And then God is mocking them for thinking themselves so big and powerful in the language. And then there's the plural form of let us go down. And Kline says that's the same idea in Genesis, with creation, that these are angelic attendants. Because we see throughout the Bible that angels are agents of judgment. So when God comes down for judgment, he also brings his agents of judgment, the means by which he often uses to judge. And so he says to the angels, let us go down, with the idea, of course, of judgment. And they want a name for themselves, and then God gives them a name, and it's called confusion. Of course, more mockery.
Right.
Here's the name you have for yourself. Kline makes an interesting point, and I never thought of it, and I remember, reading this again this week. I don't remember even thinking about this before, and I've read the book many times, is that from this point on, there were many ziggurats built. But the very fact that there were many ziggurats attests to the failure of this one temple. Because the idea was there only needed to be one.
Right.
This would be the center of religion for the world in that time. And everyone would come to their temple. But the very fact that we begin to see a lot of them just attests to the fact that this happened. That God was not going to allow this anymore. And so what does he do? He scatters them and he gives them different languages so they cannot so easily unite and do this again. So that's fascinating to think about. From one ziggurat to thousands is evidence of what happened here in Genesis 11. And Kline brings up that Satan stirred up Babylon to do the same thing, didn't he?
Right.
So Babylon tried to do this again. And of course, as soon as they try, it doesn't work. God brings, of course, the Persians to defeat the Babylonians, and Persians allow some freedom of religion, and the Israelites to go back to Jerusalem and to build the temple. And so we have sort of a future Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the cosmic tree was sort of a trying to bring back the Tower of Babel again. And of course, it was frustrated so quickly that it never happened. And so we have sort of this fake mountain of God being the temple, and then Nebuchadnezzar tries to build a mountain of God, sort of trying to bring back what they failed to do with the Garden of Eden being a mountain of God, when in that time Jerusalem was the mountain of God, right? Mount Zion.
Right.
Was where God resided. And if you wanted to worship the true God, you had to humble yourself and see it in Jerusalem. And of course, the world mocked that idea for the most part, and a few did come and believe as they were drawn to God's mountain. Many thoughts on that before we wrap up his closing thoughts on what happens here.
So obviously, sin is in the world before the Tower of Babel. I don't mean to deny that, but it really seems like this confusion brings out some tribalism. It could just be our current climate that would make me want to say things like racism, where, you just have these groups that become segregated because of language and things like that. And then there's hatred and animosity and conflict between all these different, they can't get along together anymore. Am I off in seeing this episode as really heightening that, or do you think that even those impulses were just as much present before Babel?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we don't have an opportunity in the Old Testament to see that type of thing happening. We're getting such a general description as things develop early on in Genesis. But certainly, as everybody wants to talk about racism today, but when we go back to the Tower of Babel, we see that it is simply fallen man's nature to unite around like-minded and then struggle and have problems and fight with others,
right,
who are different. It can be, ethnic, it can be national, based on language. But the very fact that they couldn't come together after this, it's just human nature. Sometimes we get caught up in the symptoms and we fail to talk about the disease, which is true for all fallen people. It's not because you're white or black or, American or anything like that.
Right.
So that's why Genesis, having that foundation of Genesis, helps us in our understanding of the world today, like you said. So Kline ends with pointing out how the frustration of tongues rein in the impulse of world dominion now, because it's obviously going to be more difficult when you have all these groups that are so simply getting along with each other as best they can and then fighting each other. And so it won't be so easy, and they'll be too busy fighting, in a sense, to try to bring about a world dominion. Rome tried, of course, and it didn't work ultimately. Now, Kline points out that this is a unique intrusion, this type of judgment. This is not how, for the rest of the world, how language is developed. And people who want to see that all mankind is represented here in Genesis 11 probably are missing that. This isn't, Kline says, the history of how language developed. This is only one group of people in the plains here. But people, Kline says, had moved into other areas, and they sort of, in a very slow, more natural sense, divided, scattered, and their languages developed. So it's not as if we can come up with some, scientific history of language, Genesis 11. Kline would say this is unique and a one-time for one group. And, a lot of people have tried to do that. Kline would say that's really not the point of how to understand this. But Kline points out that you do see common grace here, because in man being scattered and having different languages, civilization would be prolonged. There wouldn't be this attempt to take over the world. I feel like Dr. Evil when I say that, but there wouldn't be an attempt to control the world. It would be too difficult. And so life would go on, and then God's redemptive plan would unfold and would be able to unfold. That's why there didn't need to be more and more Babel judgments. Because the very fact, even when Rome tried, you always had foreign invaders coming into Rome and challenging their power, and eventually they came and scattered the whole empire. So you do see the blessings of common grace here, even though there is a curse happening, there's a judgment. It's for the general good of all mankind that God is doing that, and then ultimately for the fulfillment of his redemptive plan to save sinners throughout the world, who will obviously have to be existing in a world at that time. And then Kline ends with the typology of how the Babel exile, the disbursement throughout the world, is reversed in Pentecost. And we often say Pentecost is a reversal of Babel. It is. Because in Acts 2, you have people now speaking a common language as they're hearing the gospel. But the common language really is the gospel. I think that's the point.
Right.
That we're brought together in one message under one Father in one family again. So there's a gathering happening where people who were scattered in different languages are now in the tent again. And then ultimately, the new heavens and earth, as God's people are gathered throughout the world in this age, and then they're gathered into the new heavens and earth, you have that reversal of Babel. Again, God will gather people to himself through grace, through the gospel, to build what Adam and his posterity failed to do through the original cultural mandate. So really, everything happening today through the gospel is a reversal of Babel. It's a gathering under God of a people dedicated to him that will ultimately, we will see that fulfillment in the new heavens and earth. So in that sense, in this one incident in the judgment on Babel, we have the entire gospel and the history of the world. And how often, as we've said that at the end of one of these episodes in looking at Genesis, then that's the beauty of what Dr. Kline brought out.
Amen. Yeah, that's another just profound insight, I think, because at Babel, you had all these people who could communicate with each other, and suddenly, due to God's judgment on them, couldn't. They were perhaps thinking that they were speaking the same language, but they couldn't understand each other. But at Pentecost, you have the Holy Spirit causing the apostles to preach in such a way that everyone in attendance could understand the gospel in their own language, just completely turning Babel on its head. But around the message of the gospel, not simply life as usual.
Right. They're not being united in common grace.
Right.
They're being united in saving grace.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that is the beauty of that. And that is the true unity that the Bible speaks of. It's not a general unity that God has brought in all mankind. It's unity through the gospel of the eternal people of God being brought under the tent, or into the tent of Shem, right?
Amen.
The house of God. Yeah, so Genesis 10 and Genesis 11 preach as well, as we say. It's all gospel.
That'll preach.
Yes. That may be a good place to stop then.
Well, that was really good. Thank you very much for leading that discussion. Okay, everyone, thank you for tuning in this week. You can email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us. I am at Machen Guy. Todd is at T Bordeaux. And you can also join us on the Meredith Kline Facebook page. Just let the admins know that you listen to the podcast, and we can get you added there, and we can continue the discussion in that forum. But we hope that you'll join us again next week for some more Kingdom Prologue. We'll see you then.